Have you noticed that our attention span is getting shorter over the years? That's us looking at smart devices in conversations or in social circumstances. There's a study done at Harvard that 42% of kids between the ages of 0 and 8 years old already have their own smartphone. With the introduction of smartphones in our society, there's a lot of good and bad things that have come with it. So my question to you is, what's an appropriate age for kids to be using smart devices? I have several nieces and nephews that are given tablets and smartphones at a young age through their parents. If it's to play games or get in contact with them if they're over at their friend's house or at school. And although that may seem harmless, there's a lot of things that smartphones, if we don't monitor them correctly, can expose them to at such a young age that can really hurt the development of the brain that we need to be aware of, and especially as parents. So the first thing that I think that we need to be talking about with smartphones and kids when using them is going to be what those problems or issues that they can be exposed to are. I kind of have broken that down into three things. The first would be inappropriate conduct, inappropriate contact, and inappropriate content. The first one, inappropriate conduct, is that kids, much like us, when we use Twitter, things like that, talking online, forget that when we speak online, that we're not actually anonymous. Even though we may have usernames or things that don't directly link to ourselves, there are consequences on things we do online and say. A lot of the time, kids can forget that, and that is one of the things we need to make sure we're monitoring and taking care of. The second is going to be inappropriate content. Things like pornography, vulgar language, and explicit content that kids really shouldn't be exposed to is something we need to be aware of and monitoring to make sure that they don't get exposed to those things that's going to affect their development as a kid. Third is going to be inappropriate contact. That's kind of self-explanatory, but through applications, social media, phone, with calling and text, making sure that they're not talking with strangers or people that kids should not be in contact with, or the way they're contacting their peers, like through inappropriate means. We need to make sure we're monitoring and filtering those things. That's an issue. So how do we kind of combat that? One way to combat that as a parent is first with communication. Having a really good line of communication with your kid, especially at a young age, kind of introducing what a smartphone is and what it can do, and making sure we set guidelines and restrictions with kids at a young age. Reducing the amount of screen time they have with those devices at a young age if they don't own it and you're letting them use it. And then if we're going to give our kid a device, there's two things we can do. The first is look for what type of device we're giving them. If we are going to give them a smartphone, we want to make sure we set something up like parental controls. That's really going to filter what they can and cannot use when using a smartphone at a young age. We don't want them to have unrestricted access to the internet and social media without some type of filtration. We want to make sure that we're aware of what our kids are looking at and getting exposed to at a young age, and making sure that we set guidelines and set boundaries, guardrails, and things like that to really restrict and use what's good with the smartphone while restricting the bad. And then another option would be, if we are going to give them a phone of some form and we're not wanting them to get exposed to a lot of these things online, you can give them a phone that isn't a smartphone. That way you can text and call without them being exposed to the internet. That is another option we can do. The things we need to be aware of when we do give our kids these smartphones is there's a lot of things that come in to play that weren't really an issue when we were younger. So kids at school, through social media and apps, even with calling and texting, there's a new type of online bullying that didn't really exist when we were younger, that kids can be exposed to. And that's just one of the unforeseen things that's happened over the years with devices like this through Snapchat, where we're able to take pictures or send messages that get deleted once viewed and seen, so that there's no if a teacher catches you and tries to see what's being said or things like that, it disappears and there's no evidence left behind. Those are some ways kids can get introduced to online bullying that didn't really exist before. And then also just all of the things I mentioned before with the inappropriate content and just having the internet at their hands. There's so many websites and things that really are hard to filter if we don't really set a good line of communication and guardrails with our kids at an early age. So with that being said, smartphones have a lot of great things that can be used, especially for the youth. They're going to be exposed to this at some point in their age, if not in their youth. So I think setting up a good line of communication with our kids, letting them know the importance of why we're letting them use these devices and what they should and shouldn't be using the devices for, setting up good parental controls, making sure they're using the correct devices, and to let them be aware of the harm that can come if they abuse these devices and use them in the wrong way. As parents, I think that we're subject to understanding these things and making sure we set up the correct guardrails when allowing our kids to use something like a smartphone with school and just general use. So making sure as parents we are aware of these things and are communicating well with our kids is going to be key into making sure their development and growth into adulthood is done as well as possible.